On the morning of April 14th, 1983, the auctioneer's voice echoed across a neglected hillside outside Wenatchee, Chelan County, Washington. A cold wind swept through rows of twisted apple trees that had not been properly pruned in nearly a decade. Moss clung to the trunks. Broken irrigation pipes disappeared beneath weeds taller than a man's waist. Most people saw nothing but failure spread across 32 forgotten acres. The final bid came quietly, $4,800. A few heads turned. The woman holding the bidding card wasn't dressed like an investor. She wore faded denim, worn leather gloves tucked into one pocket, and mud-stained boots that looked as though they had spent more time in orchards and on sidewalks. She was 68 years old. Her name was Eleanor Brooks, and she had just bought the piece of land every banker in the county had written off. Someone laughed, not politely, the kind of laugh that invited everyone else to join. The sound rolled across the crowd, as if the orchard itself had become the joke. Eleanor folded her bidding card, slipped it into her jacket, and looked once toward the neglected trees. "They're still alive," she said softly. Nobody answered. Most people assumed she was talking to herself. They were wrong. The abandoned orchard had once been one of the finest Golden Delicious and Jonathan apple producers in central Washington. Back in 1956, local grower Walter Hensley had planted every row by hand after returning from military service. The trees had survived harsh winters, late frosts, scorching summers, and more harvest seasons than anyone could easily count. Then life happened. Walter's sons moved away. His wife passed in 1978. Medical bills piled higher than apple crates. The orchard slowly stopped producing enough fruit to cover taxes, equipment repairs, and labor. By 1982, the bank reclaimed the property. The irrigation system failed. Branches grew wild. Disease spread through sections nobody bothered treating. Within 1 year, everyone agreed on one thing. The orchard was finished. Everyone except Eleanor. Let me tell you about Eleanor Brooks. She had spent 43 years farming beside her husband, Thomas, on a modest apple and pear farm less than 15 miles away. Thomas had died from a heart attack during the autumn harvest of 1981, leaving Eleanor alone with memories, unpaid bills, and hands that refused to stop working. People often notice those hands before they notice her face. The skin was cracked from decades of pruning. Her fingernails carried permanent stains from soil and tree sap. Every scar had its own story. She rarely hurried, rarely complained, never wasted words. She believed orchards spoke slowly, and only patient people ever heard them. When neighbors suggested she retire, she smiled. When the trees stopped growing, she'd say, "I'll think about it." Most assumed grief had clouded her judgment. The truth was far simpler. She understood something they didn't. Across the auction yard stood David Mercer, 38 years old, vice president of Columbia Valley Agricultural Lending. He wore polished boots that had never stepped through ankle-deep orchard mud and carried himself with the confidence of someone whose numbers usually turned into profits. David wasn't cruel. He was practical. Every report crossing his desk reached the same conclusion. The orchard would cost more to restore than it could ever earn. He believed the land should be cleared and replanted from scratch. New dwarf trees, modern irrigation, fresh investment. Old orchards belonged to history. As Eleanor signed paperwork, David approached with a polite smile. "Mrs. Brooks." She looked up. "Congratulations." "Thank you. I hope you know what you bought." "I believe I do." David glanced toward the abandoned rows. "You've purchased 32 acres of dead weight." Eleanor followed his eyes. "No," she answered so gently that he almost missed it. "I bought 32 acres of neglected work." There was a difference. David simply couldn't see it. The following week, Eleanor drove onto property behind an aging 1952 Farmall M tractor. Its faded red paint had long surrendered to rust around the fenders, but the machine still carried itself with quiet determination. Her late husband had purchased it used in 1964 for $1,850 from a retired orchard outside Yakima. Powered by a 248 cubic inch four-cylinder engine producing about 38 horsepower, the Farmall had cultivated orchards, pulled sprayers, hauled fruit bins, and never once failed to start during harvest. Thomas used to say the tractor remembered every field it ever crossed. After his death, Eleanor refused every offer to replace it. People called it outdated. She called it family. The engine coughed twice before settling into deep, steady rhythm she'd known for decades. It sounded like home. Let me tell you about that old Farmall. Machines like the Farmall M weren't built to impress anyone. Nearly 270,000 were produced between 1939 and 1952, making them one of America's most dependable farm tractors. Heavy cast iron gave them remarkable durability. They were simple enough that farmers repaired them with ordinary hand tools, and many continued working well beyond 40 years. Every dent on Eleanor's tractor had been earned honestly. Every oil stain carried a memory of another season survived. She parked beneath an aging apple tree whose branches nearly touched the ground. Instead of reaching for a chainsaw, she reached for pruning shears. One branch, then another, hour after hour, day after day. Neighbors drove past shaking their heads. You'll never save those trees. They're too old. They're diseased. Cut them down. Eleanor simply kept trimming. Weeks turned into months. She removed dead limbs first, then crossing branches, then water sprouts stealing sunlight. Every cut had purpose. Nothing was rushed. Nothing wasted. By early July, David Mercer returned to inspect neighboring properties, securing new agricultural loans. He noticed Eleanor working alone beneath the afternoon sun. He stopped his truck. You've barely finished one section. She nodded. That's right. At this pace, it'll take years. I've got years. He looked across the orchard. I still think you're throwing money away. Eleanor rested both hands on her pruning saw. Maybe. David waited. She continued. But trees don't quit because people stop believing in them. He drove away unconvinced. Harvest season arrived. The orchard produced almost nothing. Only a handful of weathered apples clung to scattered branches, just enough for Eleanor to fill 3 wooden crates. Most people considered it proof she'd failed. She considered it proof the trees were still fighting. Have you ever owned something everyone else declared worthless, yet every instinct told you not to give up on it? That feeling stayed with Eleanor every evening as she locked the barn and listened to the old Farmall tick quietly while its engine cooled. Winter settled over Chelan County with freezing rain and mountain winds. Snow buried broken fences. Ice coated neglected limbs. Many believed nature would finish what time had started. Then, on the first warm afternoon of March 1984, Eleanor noticed something that made her stop walking. Tiny green buds were appearing across trees everyone had already pronounced dead, and she wasn't the only person who saw them. The first person to notice the buds after Eleanor was David Mercer. He had not planned to stop. His route that morning included 3 dairy farms, 2 wheat operations, and a meeting with a fruit-packing cooperative in Wenatchee. The abandoned orchard was simply along the highway, another reminder of an investment the bank had escaped. Or so he believed. He slowed his pickup, looked twice, then pulled onto the gravel lane. From a distance, the hillside seemed unchanged. Weathered trunks still leaned at odd angles. Old wooden posts still carried faded strands of wire. But once he stepped between the rows, he saw something the reports on his desk had never mentioned. Life. Thousands of tiny green buds. Not scattered. Not accidental. Everywhere. Eleanor was kneeling beside a tree, scraping loose bark from one branch with a small orchard knife. She didn't seem surprised to see him. You found them, she said. David nodded slowly. I honestly didn't think I would. She smiled. They were always here. He picked up one of the trimmed branches lying nearby. I don't understand. You will. For the first time since the auction, David asked a question instead of offering advice. What exactly did you do? Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her knees. I removed everything the tree couldn't afford to keep. He frowned. What does that mean? It means a tree spends energy just like people do. She pointed toward a thick, dead limb. Every dead branch steals sunlight. Another branch. Crossing limbs rub wounds into healthy wood. Another. Too many shoots divide strength. David listened without interrupting. I didn't make these trees live, Eleanor continued. I simply stopped them from wasting what life they still had. The answer sounded almost too simple, yet the bud surrounded them. Real, growing, impossible to argue with. Let me tell you about old apple orchards. Unlike annual crops, an apple orchard is an investment measured in decades instead of seasons. Many standard rootstock trees planted during the 1940s and 1950s developed deep root systems capable of reaching moisture modern dwarf orchards often couldn't access without irrigation. They demanded patience, careful pruning, proper airflow, balanced nutrition. Neglected long enough, they appeared hopeless. But appearances often fooled people unfamiliar with mature orchards. Eleanor understood that. Most others didn't. News traveled surprisingly fast through Chelan County. Coffee shops, feed stores, packing sheds. People began talking. They say Brooks' orchard is budding. No chance. I drove by yesterday. So did I. What did you see? I think she's actually bringing it back. The conversations usually ended with disbelief, not admiration. Not yet. By May, blossoms covered sections of the orchard in soft white and pale pink. Bees drifted through the rows from sunrise until late afternoon. The abandoned hillside looked different. Hope had a color. David returned again, this time carrying a notebook. I've counted almost 400 healthy trees. Eleanor corrected him. 423. You counted? I planted enough orchards to know every row. He laughed quietly, not mockingly, respectfully. Of course you did. She handed him a weathered notebook. Inside were handwritten records dating back almost 11 months. Rainfall, pruning dates, tree conditions, bloom timing, even notes about which birds had returned first each spring. David looked up. You wrote all this? I didn't trust my memory. He flipped another page. Every tree had a number. Every row had observations. Every problem had a plan. The work wasn't guesswork. It was discipline, but not everyone appreciated discipline. Late that June, the Chelan Valley Growers Association hosted its annual Orchard Field Day. Farmers gathered to examine new irrigation systems, spray equipment, and high-density planting methods. Someone mentioned Eleanor, a younger orchard owner named Brian Holloway, 34 years old, overheard the conversation. Brian had expanded quickly during the previous decade. Brand new equipment, satellite yield mapping, computerized irrigation scheduling. He believed older farming methods belonged in museums. That old orchard? Brian said loudly. The one she bought for $4,800? Someone nodded. Brian laughed. Not a smile, not a chuckle, a loud, confident laugh that rolled through the crowd. Several others joined him. She's polishing a gravestone. More laughter. You could plant new trees today and make more money before hers recover. Another round. Someone pointed toward Eleanor, who had quietly arrived to listen to one of the demonstrations. She heard every word. So did everyone else. The laughter lingered longer than anyone admitted afterward. Brian walked toward her. I've got to ask. She waited. What makes you think you can outsmart 40 years of orchard economics? The crowd grew silent. Eleanor looked toward the distant mountains before answering. I don't. Brian folded his arms. I think 40 years of orchard economics are smarter than both of us. Nobody expected that response. Neither did Brian. She continued, the trees aren't asking me to perform miracles. She gently touched one weathered branch displayed for pruning practice. They're asking me not to interrupt what they already know how to do. No anger, no pride, no raised voice, just quiet certainty. The crowd didn't laugh again. Brian looked away first. Later that afternoon, David found Eleanor loading tools into the Farmall. They embarrassed you. She shrugged. They laughed. Doesn't that bother you? She climbed onto the tractor. When people laugh before the harvest, they're usually guessing. The Farmall started on its second crank. David watched it disappear between the blossoming rows. He couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Let me tell you about that old tractor one more time. Most people measure machinery by horsepower. Farmers like Eleanor measured it by trust. The Farmall M weighed roughly 5,500 pounds, enough to hold steady on uneven orchard ground while compacting soil as heavily as newer equipment. Its naturally aspirated engine delivered power smoothly at lower engine speeds, allowing careful work around aging trees whose roots spread unpredictably beneath the surface. The tractor had become almost an extension of Eleanor herself, slow when necessary, strong when required, never trying to prove anything. Around midsummer, David noticed another change. Wildflowers had begun returning between the orchard rows. Not weeds, native flowers, clover, yarrow, lupin. Bees multiplied. So did birds. Even the soil looked darker, healthier. He asked Eleanor why she wasn't spraying every inch clean. She smiled. An orchard shouldn't be silent. He looked around. The air buzzed with insects. Birdsong echoed through branches. It never occurred to me, he admitted. It usually doesn't. By September 1984, the first meaningful harvest arrived. It wasn't enormous. Far from it. But it filled more than 80 wooden apple bins. Fruit buyers who had ignored the orchard the previous year suddenly began asking questions. Where had these apples come from? How old were the trees? Who was managing the property? The answer surprised every one of them. David stood beside the loading dock as workers stacked crate after crate. He remembered the words he'd spoken at the auction. 32 acres of dead weight. He had never been more wrong. Yet Eleanor wasn't celebrating. She kept studying the trees, walking every row, looking upward instead of backward. David finally asked why. She answered with only one sentence. This orchard still hasn't shown us what it's capable of. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Washington State Department of Agriculture requesting an inspection of the property after reports of unusually healthy fruit coming from an orchard that official records still classified as commercially exhausted. The inspector wasn't coming to admire the harvest. He was coming to decide whether Eleanor's impossible success was hiding something no one else had imagined. The letter arrived on October 11, 1984. It was stamped with the seal of the Washington State Department of Agriculture and carried only a few paragraphs. But every sentence mattered. An inspection had been scheduled for the following Tuesday. The department wanted to evaluate the orchard after receiving multiple reports that fruit quality from the long-abandoned property exceeded expectations despite years of neglect. Rumors had spread faster than apples ever could. Some growers believed Eleanor had secretly replanted sections of the orchard. Others insisted she had used experimental chemicals. A few claimed she had somehow altered official production records. David Mercer read the letter twice before handing it back. "Are you worried?" Eleanor folded it carefully. "No, they'll be looking for mistakes. They're welcome to." She tucked the envelope into her jacket. "The trees don't know they're being inspected." The morning of October 16th arrived clear and cold. Mist drifted across the hills above Wenatchee, while pickup trucks lined the gravel road leading into the orchard. The state inspector stepped out first. His name was Harold Simmons. 61 years old, a horticultural specialist who had spent more than 3 decades studying commercial orchards across Washington. Behind him came 2 agricultural technicians. David Mercer arrived a few minutes later. So did Brian Holloway. Neither wanted to admit why they had come. Curiosity had finally become stronger than pride. Harold shook Eleanor's hand. "I've heard quite a story." She smiled gently. "You'll have to decide whether it's true." For nearly 4 hours they walked every section of the property. Harold measured trunk diameters, examined pruning scars, collected soil samples, cut open apples, checked irrigation lines, studied leaf color, measured sugar content using a handheld refractometer. Every test pointed in the same direction. Healthy trees, healthy soil, healthy fruit. Nothing artificial, nothing suspicious, only patience. At lunchtime, the inspector stood quietly beneath one of the oldest golden delicious trees. This orchard shouldn't be producing at this level. Eleanor nodded. It wasn't. What changed? She looked toward the hillside. Someone finally listened to it. Harold smiled. "I was hoping for a technical answer. You'll find one." She tapped the trunk with her hand. "But it starts there. David watched the conversation from a distance. The woman everyone had dismissed was calmly explaining an orchard to one of the state's leading experts. Not by showing off, by showing the trees. Let me tell you about soil. Most people think healthy orchards begin with fertilizer. They don't. They begin underground, where billions of microorganisms break down organic matter into nutrients roots can absorb. Years of fallen leaves, decaying grass, earthworms, and beneficial fungi create living soil instead of dead dirt. Mature apple trees with deep root systems often survive difficult seasons because those roots reach moisture and minerals far below the surface. Fertilizer can help, but it can never replace healthy soil biology. Eleanor understood that restoring the ground was more important than forcing faster growth above it. Healthy roots build healthy trees, and healthy trees eventually reward patient farmers. The explanation lasted only a few minutes, but David never forgot it. Neither did Brian. The inspection concluded late that afternoon. Harold gathered everyone near the old equipment shed. I've inspected orchards for 34 years. He paused. This is one of the finest examples of restorative orchard management I've ever seen. Silence, then quiet applause. Not loud, not dramatic, honest. Brian looked down at his boots. He remembered laughing. Everyone else remembered it too. When the crowd dispersed, he walked toward Eleanor. I owe you something. She waited. An apology. She said nothing. I laughed because I thought experience had finally lost to modern farming. He shook his head. I was wrong. Eleanor smiled. We've all been wrong about something. I embarrassed you. You embarrassed yourself. Brian nodded. That's true. Then she surprised him. Would you like to learn how to prune one of these trees? He blinked. You'd teach me, if you're willing to learn. For the next hour, they worked side by side. No audience, no speeches, just pruning shears clicking through old branches. Brian asked dozens of questions. Eleanor answered every one. Patiently. By sunset, he understood why the orchard had changed. Not because of magic, because every cut had been made with tomorrow in mind. Have you ever been absolutely certain you were right, only to discover that someone working quietly beside you had understood the truth all along? It's a humbling feeling. Sometimes it's also the beginning of wisdom. That winter proved Eleanor's methods were no accident. Heavy snow blanketed Chelan County during January 1985, followed by a severe cold snap that pushed nighttime temperatures below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Several newly planted commercial orchards suffered serious damage. Young trees split under freezing conditions. Branches cracked. Entire rows had to be replaced. Farmers estimated losses in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. When spring finally returned, people drove past Eleanor's property expecting similar destruction. Instead, they found something remarkable. The older trees had survived almost untouched. Deep roots, strong trunks, balanced pruning. Everything worked together. David stood beside the Farmall as Eleanor prepared another season. I finally understand. She looked at him. What do you understand? You weren't saving an abandoned orchard. He glanced across the hillside. You were protecting decades of decisions made by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Eleanor nodded slowly. That's closer. He laughed softly. I'm still learning. So am I. A few weeks later, Brian returned. Not to argue, to ask permission. I've got 12 acres of older trees everyone says I should remove. Eleanor closed the gate behind her. What do you think? He hesitated. I think I'd like to look at them before I cut them down. She smiled. That's a good place to start. Word spread beyond Chelan County. Farmers from Yakima, Okanagan, Douglas, even parts of Oregon began visiting the orchard. They walked the rows with notebooks, photographed pruning techniques, studied soil management, asked questions Eleanor always answered with quiet generosity. David noticed something unexpected. The conversations had changed. 3 years earlier, people had asked why anyone would buy the orchard. Now they asked whether it was for sale. Offers began arriving. First $40,000, then $95,000. By late summer, one fruit company offered $180,000 for the 32 acres. Eleanor thanked him, then declined every offer without hesitation. David finally asked why. She rested one hand on the weathered hood of the 1952 Farmall M. This place was abandoned once. She looked across the rows where bees drifted through thousands of blossoms. It won't be abandoned again. A week later, another buyer appeared. This one didn't come with a checkbook. He came with something far more difficult to refuse. And what he placed on Eleanor's porch before sunrise would change not only the orchard's future, but the future of every farmer who had once laughed at it. Before sunrise, on September 3rd, 1986, Eleanor opened her front door expecting nothing more than the morning newspaper. Instead, she found a small wooden apple crate. Inside was an envelope. Beneath it lay a pair of worn pruning shears. She recognized them immediately. They had belonged to Walter Hensley, the man who planted the orchard in 1956. The envelope contained a single handwritten note. If anyone deserves to carry this orchard into its next 50 years, it's you. It was signed by Walter's youngest son, Richard Hensley, who had driven from Spokane the night before after hearing that strangers were offering to buy the family orchard his father had loved. Richard had avoided the property for years. The memories had been too painful. Now, walking to the restored rows, he no longer saw the abandoned place where his father's dream had ended. He saw the orchard his father had believed could outlive him. Eleanor held the old pruning shears for a long moment. "They've come home," she whispered. David Mercer arrived later that morning. "So that's why you refused every offer." Eleanor nodded. This orchard was never waiting for a buyer. She looked toward the trees. It was waiting for someone willing to care for it. Richard stayed for nearly a week. Together, he and Eleanor walked every row. He pointed to trees he remembered planting as a boy. She showed him the branches that had returned to full production. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply listened to the wind moving through the leaves. Both were enough. By the end of the harvest, the orchard produced more than 1,100 bushels of market-quality apples, the strongest crop since the late 1970s. Buyers who once ignored the property now scheduled contracts months in advance. Local packing houses began requesting fruit specifically from Eleanor's orchard because of its consistent quality and flavor. 3 years earlier, no one had wanted the land. Now, every farmer wanted to know how she had done it. Eleanor answered every question the same way. "I started by believing the trees." She never claimed to possess secret knowledge. She never called herself extraordinary. She simply insisted that every orchard deserved someone willing to understand it before judging it. David changed more than anyone expected. The banker who had once dismissed the property rewrote how his office evaluated older orchards. Instead of recommending immediate removal, he began encouraging owners to seek restoration plans before clearing mature trees. Younger loan officers thought he had become overly sentimental. He smiled whenever they said it. "No," he would answer. "I've just learned the difference between old and finished." Brian Holloway changed as well. The laughter that had once echoed across the growers' meeting became something he carried as a reminder of his own pride. He restored 12 acres of mature apple trees on his own farm instead of bulldozing them. 2 years later, those same trees produced one of his best harvests. Whenever neighbors congratulated him, he pointed toward Eleanor's orchard. "I borrowed the idea," he admitted, "and I'm still learning." The old 1952 Farmall M remained exactly where people expected to find it, working. Every spring it pulled pruning wagons. Every summer it hauled irrigation pipe. Every autumn it carried wooden apple bins to waiting trucks. Children visiting the orchard often climbed onto its steel seat, while Eleanor explained how Thomas had bought it in 1964 and how careful maintenance mattered more than shiny paint. The tractor became part of the orchard story, not because it was valuable, because it had never stopped showing up. Years passed. The trees grew stronger. The branches spread wider. The orchard became a place where local agriculture students, young growers, and even state horticulture classes came to study restorative orchard management. They expected to learn about pruning. Instead, they often left talking about patience. In the autumn of 1994, Eleanor officially transferred daily responsibility for the orchard to her daughter, Sarah Brooks, who had returned home after years working as an agricultural extension educator. Nothing changed overnight. That was exactly how Eleanor wanted it. She still walked the rows each morning, still carried Walter's old pruning shears, still stopped to rest one hand on the hood of the Farmall before beginning the day's work. One crisp October evening in 1998, Eleanor completed her final walk through the orchard. She paused beneath the very first tree she had pruned after buying property for $4,800. Its branches bent gently under the weight of healthy fruit. She smiled, then quietly headed home. She passed away peacefully in her sleep later that winter at the age of 83. There were no newspaper headlines, no television crews, only neighbors, farmers, friends, and rows of apple trees standing exactly where she had believed they would. At her memorial service, David Mercer spoke last. I once called this place 32 acres of dead weight. He looked across the orchard. I've never been happier to spend the rest of my life remembering how wrong I was. The Farmall was parked nearby, freshly washed, ready for another season. Sarah kept the orchard exactly as her mother had taught her. Every spring brought blossoms. Every autumn brought harvest. Every year brought visitors asking the same question. Why didn't she sell when? The offers became so large. Sarah always smiled before answering, because some things become priceless the moment you stop measuring them in dollars. Today, decades later, the orchard still produces apples. The original trees that survived Eleanor's careful restoration continue to bear fruit beside younger plantings that ensure the land will remain productive for generations. The Farmall M still starts with its familiar steady rumble, and Walter Hensley's pruning shears still hang inside the equipment shed, sharpened every winter, ready for another season of careful hands. Some things aren't rescued because they're valuable. They become valuable because someone cared enough to rescue them. If this story reminded you of someone who refused to give up on a piece of land, an old machine, or a dream everyone else had abandoned, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. I read every story because they're part of preserving the quiet wisdom that built farms like these. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who turned a flooded hay field into the most productive pasture in his county after everyone called it worthless, that story is waiting for us in the next video. Until then, thank you for walking these roads with me.